So thanks, Echo. So just please insert questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll field them after. So go ahead, Mark.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining this evening. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my work, especially as a deep admirer of everything that Career Peace Now does. So I'm going to share my screen here as we get started. Okay, is that PowerPoint showing up for everyone? Okay, great. So I'm just going to jump right in and share some snippets of my research that's focused on Asian American internationalism and anti-imperialism during the Cold War. And I hope in our Q&A and discussion, we can kind of draw out some of the connections of that political moment and this critical context that we're in today. So I want to start by kind of zooming into a particular moment in the Asian American movement. On May 12th, 1972, a crowd of about 500 students, workers, and other community members marched through San Francisco's Chinatown during a protest of the continuation of the US war in Southeast Asia. And so this protest was called by a new umbrella group called the Bay Area Asians Against the War. And they were responding to the kind of escalation of US airstrikes on Vietnam, despite the Nixon administration's kind of commitment towards disengagement. And so this Asian coalition organized this march through Chinatown, and during a brief rally in Portsmouth Square, speakers drove home the importance of supporting the peace proposal of the Provisional Government of South Vietnam. From there, the march continued through Chinatown on its way towards joining a broader anti-war protest at Union Square. But along the way, the crowd stopped for a moment and watched as a curious symbol went up in flames. Standing on Stockton Street before the branch office of the Kuomintang, or KMT party, Taiwan's ruling party, members of the protest committee burned an effigy of Chiang Kai-shek, the strongman president of the Republic of China government in Taiwan. So why invoke Chiang Kai-shek in a protest of the Nixon administration's escalation in Vietnam? What were the forces that rendered the leader of the ROC an appropriate target for the Asian American anti-war movement? And so I start with this anecdote because I think that answering these questions can help us to better understand the unique conditions that produced Asian American anti-imperialism during the 1970s. And so within Asian American studies and within kind of Asian American political spaces, we often kind of gesture to this moment in the late 1960s and the early 1970s as kind of this nostalgic high point for Asian American solidarity. But I think that there's more kind of analytical work that we can do to really think about what the tactics and strategies that produced third worldism in Asian American communities were. And so to the extent that we might hear about the Asian American anti-war movement at all, we might hear about this idea of third world solidarity. Oftentimes we might hear the kind of sense of racial identification that many Asian Americans felt during the war in Vietnam, faced with news stories and images of mass death in Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia. But I think part of the important intervention that Asian American anti-imperialists made within the broader anti-war movement is that they really understood the war in Vietnam as part of this broader structure of US imperialism in Asia. And this was a structure that, not only impacted Vietnam, but also impacted other Asian nations that were struggling for national liberation, and which many of the largest Asian American communities at the time, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese Americans could, recognize in their own countries of ancestry these struggles and confrontations with U.S. empire. And so within an organization like the Bay Area Asian Coalition, there were member organizations that were comprised of Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Japanese Americans who each in different ways could connect, the war in Southeast Asia to their own countries of ancestry. Filipino Americans, for instance, noted the flow of war munitions from the Philippines Subic Naval Base, a key hub for US naval logistics. Japanese Americans confronted Japan's complicity in the war, as well as the departure of American bomber jets from occupied Okinawa. And Chinese Americans worried that Chinese military aid to North Vietnam could escalate into outright war with the US. And so, within this anti-war movement, you see kind of parallel and kind of sub-campaigns and protests that engage these different issues that, for instance, confront US non-recognition of the People's Republic of China, US support for the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, and US militarism in Japan and Okinawa. And so I think, understanding Asian American relationships to each of these struggles is a way of really understanding the broader kind of ideological framework that undergirded anti-imperialism and really made concrete this slogan of the anti-war movement, which was one struggle, many fronts. So on the one hand, we see Asian American anti-imperialism engaging this like global analysis of US empire in Asia and its kind of regional interdependence on various forms of occupation and containment. But also, Asian American anti-imperialists in an important way really grounded their politics and their struggle in an understanding of the local manifestations of US imperialism. And so in San Francisco, Asian American anti-imperialists really linked the war abroad to the phenomena of urban renewal, gentrification, and the material conditions facing the city's working class Asian American communities. So for instance, after its founding conference, the Bay Area Asian Coalition kind of described their motivations in their newsletter. They stated, quote, "To relate these concepts in meaningful terms means that we have to address ourselves to the realities of the daily lives of our people. Rotten housing, redevelopment, police repression, unemployment, taxes, poor healthcare, all can be related to the war and its cause, the greedy jaws of big business, or more exactly, US imperialism." And so particularly, being based in San Francisco, organizers put forward this idea that as we see in this zine clipping, San Francisco grows on war. Alongside, U.S. Cold War intervention in Asia, San Francisco is really kind of a focal point for financial development that situated San Francisco as kind of a staging grounds for this imperial foray across the Pacific and into Asia. And so these processes of urban renewal, the growth of high rises like the Bank of America building and the financial district were really acutely felt in Chinatown, Manilatown, and Japantown, these historic community bases for Asian American working class people. And so through local anti-eviction campaigns, promotion of senior housing, community food programs, all of these efforts were ways that the anti-war and the anti-imperialist movement were grounded in terms that were relevant to these material conditions, and really put forward this idea that imperialism was not only, a foreign kind of phenomenon happening far away across the Pacific, but was a structure that could be understood and needed to be confronted in local and intimate terms. And so this pamphlet that I'm showing a clipping of here, distributed by a draft counseling center in Chinatown and Manilatown, described this intimacy between local issues around redevelopment and the war abroad. They wrote, quote, "The next time you see another window added to a downtown high-rise, you can be assured it shines at the cost of someone's life in the Pacific. And so I want to think more about how the Asian American movement really diagnosed imperialism as both a global and a local phenomenon by diving a little bit more into detail into the context of Chinatown campaigns against the war. And so in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, we see this emergence of kind of a new generation of Chinatown leftist organizations. The Red Guards, founded in San Francisco, Iwar Quinn, founded in New York City, Y-Men-Say, also founded in San Francisco. All of these organizations, despite some important kind of political differences and political debates, they all shared, in general, kind of an ideological program staked to support for the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government of China, ideological inspiration from Maoism, and also really like a local political program that was rooted in both an understanding of the broader geopolitics of US strategy in Asia, as well as kind of the way that the Chinatown establishment itself was really enmeshed in the prerogatives of the US state and US empire. And so in order to build kind of solidarity and mass consciousness around the war in Vietnam and building an anti-imperialist consciousness, organizers really linked kind of the histories of China and Vietnam and China's own history of Western imperialism. For instance, at a San Francisco anti-war rally in 1972, organizer Barbara Tang drove home the connections between the war in Vietnam and China's own experiences with Western empire. She stated in her speech, quote, "For the Chinese people, the war in Indochina strikes home, for we can never forget the leading role the US played in forging the so-called open door policy in the latter part of the 19th century." And, you know, importantly, that history was drawn into their present moment, in particular, noting the US intervention into the Chinese Civil War through its support for the KMT, which had fled to Taiwan in 1949, and as of the early 1970s was still recognized by the US as the government of China. And so in her speech, Tang linked the US-backed Ngo Dinh Diem government in South Vietnam to other so-called puppet regimes supported by the US throughout Asia, first and foremost, the Chiang Kai-shek government in Taiwan. Similarly, Iwar Quinn diagnosed US aspirations to, as they put it, quote, "control China through the Chiang Kai-shek clique in the same way she is controlling South Vietnam today." And so as part of, you know, this broader anti-war movement, Chinese American anti-imperialists rallied behind the demand for the US to recognize the People's Republic of China, to normalize diplomatic relations, and to end support for Chiang Kai-shek's martial law government in Taiwan. And so this kind of anti-imperialist politics, again, was really rooted in a local understanding of the way that imperialism was shaping Chinatown community politics itself. For many decades, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, also known as the Chinese Six Companies, had served as really the de facto representative of Chinese Americans and a liaison between the community and the US government. And so this conservative establishment really had deep financial and political links to the KMT government in Taiwan. And so, you know, as part of this anti-imperialist struggle, organizations like Iwar Quinn had to confront this endemic kind of conservatism and anti-communism in their own communities. And this, you know, this anti-communism had a long history. Since the founding of the PRC in 1949, the CCBA had used its power to, on the one hand, pledge the anti-communist loyalty of Chinese Americans, and also to suppress leftists in their own community. So, for instance, in 1951, we see this really vivid photograph of a rally that the CCBA sponsored in support of the US intervention in Korea, and really, recognizing China's role in supporting socialist Korea and fighting essentially a proxy war against the United States. These Chinatown establishment groups kind of felt the impetus to declare themselves on the right side of the Cold War. And so for many decades, the CCBA had really partnered with the US state government to lead anti-communist and Red Scare programs in Chinatowns across the United States. And into the 1970s, used kind of their pretense to speak for Chinese Americans to, again, like pledge their allegiance to US Cold War ideology. So here, for instance, we see a 1970 advertisement taken out in the New York Times opposing the PRC's seating in the United Nations and claiming to represent 20 million overseas Chinese. And so, Chinese American anti-imperialists had to confront and engage in this community struggle against KMT rule and the struggle over kind of who could speak for Chinese Americans, both in a local context and in the context of this Cold War ideological terrain. And one of the strategies that they used to do this was, again, like linking the material conditions of Chinatowns to the kind of neglect of the US government and the mismanagement of the KMT establishment in Chinatown. And so issues like overcrowding, poverty, housing displacement, and police harassment in Chinatowns across the US were really put in the context of this broader struggle against the KMT in a local and global paradigm. And so I'm going to kind of move quickly to make sure that we have time for Q&A, but this flyer kind of represents this broader struggle for normalization and diplomatic recognition of China as part of the struggle through which the Chinatown left, on the one hand, advanced a geopolitical demand for normalization and recognition of the PRC. But this was also really a process of democratization in American Chinatowns. The ability for Chinese Americans to rally in support of the PRC, to openly host, for instance, film screenings of films from China. All of these kinds of public events happening in Chinatown in the early 1970s were really like a historic feat that required a lot of struggle and that faced a lot of actually physical repression from the KMT and the CCBA. And so this was really a long struggle that was staked, both to the war in Vietnam, but also understood this larger matrix of US empire as it manifested in the context of China's unfinished civil war, as well as, the community politics of Chinatown itself. And so to wrap up, I want to zoom out a little bit and gesture towards some of the legacy and kind of contemporary relevance of our context today. Of course, we've seen huge geopolitical shifts between the US and China since the 1970s. We've seen huge demographic changes to Asian American communities, but I think that there's still an importance of many of the lessons and analyses of the Asian American movement. I think, the emphasis that Asian American anti-imperialists during the 1970s had of kind of the regional connections between struggles against US empire in different Asian nations is really relevant today as the US kind of instrumentalizes its relationships with different nations, different allies or junior partners in order to really advance kind of the new Cold War against China. And we've seen this really just in the past year. In 2023, for instance, Biden and Marcos struck this new deal for US military base access in northern Philippines, noted for their kind of strategic proximity towards Taiwan. And last year as well, we saw the US pursuing these new security pacts between the US, Japan, and South Korea, again, with both kind of China and North Korea being kind of the fixture or the source of this discourse of imminent threat that the U.S. kind of uses to justify its presence abroad. And in the domestic sphere, we've seen kind of the rise of Red Scare tactics and xenophobia within the US, even amongst politicians like Nancy Pelosi, who on the one hand have kind of rhetorically put out statements opposing anti-Asian hate while at the same time resorting to red baiting and xenophobia. So I think many of us, saw and were really disturbed by Pelosi's comments just a couple weeks ago, suggesting that pro-Palestinian protesters should go back to China. And so, I think we're in this moment in which these questions over national loyalty, questions of community representation continue to be waged in ways that really inherit a lot of the struggles and conflicts of the past. So I'll end it here and hope that we can dive more into some of these connections in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mark. So yes, and thank you for that analysis, and thanks to those who have submitted some questions in the chat. Just to remind folks, if you wouldn't mind, now that we're kind of in the Q&A discussion section, if you would be able to turn your cameras on or just send a note to Echo just about, your situation, just so we can know who's in the room and who we're talking to. And also we can just speak freely about our questions. So I guess first, Mark, I'll just ask, and if you have questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat and we'll field them to Mark. So first, Doug asked, what if any impacted Nixon and Kissinger's opening of China have on their and other US presidents, Ford and Carter, response to protests in the US regarding American imperialism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see, I think, a follow-up question also from Doug about though the US eventually recognized the PRC and adopted what was called the One China policy, why didn't that happen as a result of Nixon's visit? Yeah, so I can mostly speak from kind of this Chinese American community politics perspective. Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972 obviously was a huge watershed moment, both in US-China relations, but also for Chinese American community politics. And, given this conservative political establishment in Chinatowns, that visit was hugely unpopular. On the one hand, amongst, these kind of political leaders in Chinatown, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association really put out a media blitz of statements opposing the visit, opposing any move towards recognizing the PRC as the government of China. And even into the early 1980s, voicing, steadfast support for the KMT as the legitimate representative of China. And so I think that this kind of more grassroots and working class Chinatown perspective that I was gesturing to in the talk, while it's difficult to say how it may have impacted US policy at kind of a top-down level, at a community level, I think it was really impactful in terms of presenting an alternative politics for Chinese Americans and a different way of relating both to China and to the US in a way that allowed for political space and, quite literally public space for kind of a socialist identification, a socialist Chinese American politics and an anti-imperialist Chinese American politics. And so I think many of these organizations waged through the 1970s this long struggle, recognizing that, even though in 1972, Nixon and Kissinger ostensibly are committing to a one China policy and starting to move towards recognition of the PRC. It's not until 1979 that that happens. And so Chinatown organizers really kind of rally behind this slogan of, to paraphrase, something along the lines of like, politicians will not make normalization happen, the masses will. And so, again, while it's hard to say, what direct impact these campaigns had on high level policy, it really, I think, was important in like empowering community members to see themselves as participants in diplomacy and as agents who could kind of challenge this conservative consensus in Chinatown.
Thanks, Mark. Another question we had, and I might just add to it from Mark Harrison. So the question is, where does India fit in this? And I might add to that question, just like you referenced the founding of Asian America around like the 70s and the nostalgia on the Third World Liberation Front. The question of like, who is in Asian America, who is out of Asian America, is so tied to, the complexity of how we define Asia. And there's a lot of discussion now, and it has been for some time, about in what way is Palestine in Asia. I mean, we had Viet Thanh has been writing a lot about this, and like The Nation most recently. And I guess how would you diagnose the shape of Asian American anti-imperialism and how it's changed over time with respect to how we conceive of and imagine Asia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. I think, I think that when it comes to the demographics of Asian America, of course, it has shifted a lot since the 60s and 70s, where that was a moment in which Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese Americans made up a large majority of the Asian American population, and were really the central kind of players in the early Asian American movement. I think for me, the question of demographics and like who is included in Asian America, in some ways, I think it's useful to reframe it from a demographic question to like a political question. And so, recognizing that Asian American identity was always a political identity. It was one that was created not necessarily out of an inherently shared culture or shared language or even shared kind of racialization, but it was based on a shared politics. And I think that in particular, I would argue that Asian American political identity was staked to an anti-imperialist politics that, as I was discussing, really understood how national liberation struggles in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Japan, in Okinawa, were all connected, and all connected because US imperialism, found it useful to occupy Okinawa in order to contain China, or to, support martial law in the Philippines in order to use Philippines military bases for the war in Vietnam. And so I think that, through this matrix of empire and anti-imperialism, when it comes to an issue like Palestine, for me, the question is less like, technically or geographically, Palestine is part of Asia, and so we should conceive of, this Asian American politics to include Palestine. For me, it's more like, right now in this political moment, Palestine is a central site for resistance to US imperialism and its partner in Zionism. And so how do we as Asian Americans relate to that struggle? And how do we relate that struggle to, the way that US imperialism is currently impacting Korea or the Philippines, for instance? And I think that lens hopefully opens up a lot of kind of different ways of thinking about the interconnection of our struggles.
Thank you. We have some great questions in the chat. But first I see Kale, you have your hand up. So do you want to ask yours, and then I'll get back to the chat questions?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Mark, for this great presentation. I wanted to ask, in your research, have you found any specifics, about the Red Guard parties? Did it have any links to like other parts of the Chinese-speaking world, like say Hong Kong or Taiwan during the late 1960s?
Yeah, so groups like the Red Guards, obviously they took their name from inspiration from China's Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards in China. Um, a lot of those ties were mostly ideological. As I mentioned, like Maoism was the guiding political philosophy that guided their work and guided the way the organization was run. Um, there were through the 70s some trips and delegations made to the PRC by members of the Asian American movement and the Chinese American community in particular. Um, I don't believe that those trips led to any like sustained deep political connections, but was certainly very symbolic and emotional experience for many organizers to be able to like visit China after many decades of that being impossible for Chinese Americans to visit the mainland. And I'll also say, when it comes to Hong Kong and Taiwan, um, there was a population of like overseas Hong Kong and Taiwan students in the US during the Asian American movement. And so there were some intersections between like overseas students from Hong Kong and Taiwan and American born Chinese in some of these political parties. I think San Francisco's Wyman Say organization was one that I think was explicitly formed out of kind of a partnership between Chinese Americans who were like rooted in working class Chinatown, San Francisco background, and overseas students who were studying at schools like UC Berkeley, who kind of like came together behind a shared uh, kind of identity as Chinese people and in identification with kind of these socialist struggles in Asia. So.
Thanks. We have a question from Tasha. She asks, was xenophobia a huge issue in the US during the active years of the Korean War and the years that followed? I know this was an issue in ROK among anti-communists in the years following 1950, 1953, due to the Chinese Red Army's involvement during the Korean War.
Yeah, so xenophobia was certainly a huge phenomenon in the US during the 50s in particular, but through the 70s and obviously also happening again today. And in some ways it was, on the one hand, a reaction to the 1949 Chinese end of the Chinese Civil War and the formation of the PRC as, a socialist Chinese government. But also really intensified with the outbreak of the Korean War and US intervention in Korea and China's entrance into the Korean War as well in support of the DPRK. And so, that image that I shared of this Chinatown rally in support of the US war in Korea, I think was really a response to this ideological context in which many Chinese Americans feared that the war in Korea might lead to, direct confrontation between the US and China. This was also less than a decade after World War II, when almost 200,000 Japanese Americans had been incarcerated because of the US war with Japan. And so there was a very visceral fear that mass incarceration of Chinese Americans was a possibility because of US antagonism towards China. And so I think, the strategy of kind of the Chinatown establishment, given their conservatism and given their ties to the KMT in Taiwan, was really to like avoid any any association between Chinese Americans and the People's Republic of China. And that was achieved in part through these like symbolic demonstrations and symbolic pledges of loyalty to the US, and also through like really sustained repression. And so one of the I think, most kind of systemic aspects of McCarthyism during the Cold War that we don't often talk about was a program called the Chinese Confession Program that the US Immigration Bureau at the time launched to, at least at face value, to offer a pathway for Chinese Americans who immigrated during the exclusion era and had used kind of fake names in order to game the system to normalize their status. So they asked members of Chinese American communities, like, you know, exclusion is over. We want you to be citizens. Come forward and, you know, confess if you are someone who used fake papers or the descendant of someone who used fake papers, and we will adjust your status, and like nothing bad is going to happen to you. And for the most part, that is what happened to Chinese Americans who came forward to confess. But US immigration, in partnership with like the Chinese six companies, the establishment of Chinatowns, also used this as an opportunity to target those who had ties to or were alleged to have ties to the People's Republic of China. And so many leftists who were known in the Chinese American community as having progressive or leftist or socialist politics were actually like detained and deported through this program. And so I think that's like an important history of really state-sanctioned xenophobia and anti-communism that was also enabled by like Chinese American community leaders. And I think that is a dynamic in which, you know, Chinese American inclusion and Chinese American civil rights are made to be dependent on professing anti-communism and embracing a certain American ideological stance and foreign policy stance is really relevant to the context that we're facing today.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll also add just briefly, like for Korean American activists during that time, many were also targeted by FBI immigration officials. One, Diamond Kim here, also was, you know, accused of having communist affiliations and exercising his constitutional right to refuse to answer. Took his case up to the Supreme Court, was hauled in front of Congress, in front of the House Un-American Affairs Committee, and refused to answer, and there was nothing on his record. And that was noted in a dissenting opinion by Justice Black, but was nevertheless deported. And the congressional testimony show how congressional leaders refer to him as being associated with Soviet communism, and in many ways he was a Korean nationalist. I'll also share, okay, James and Sujin had kind of tag teamed related questions. Find very interesting. So James asked, while I haven't seen empirical evidence on this, it feels to me like solidarity in Asian American communities has lessened since the 60s and 70s. What were some of the reasons for this shift? Did neoliberal efforts, quote, win? Was it more so due to shifts in immigration policy, or was it a result of less immediate imperial violence in Asian nations? And Sujin asked, was there a specific moment in time or specific moment / time focus went from anti-imperialism to normalization of Asians as Americans? I feel like we see much more of the latter than the former nowadays.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of dynamics that we can attribute this shift to. On the one hand, yeah, I think that the nature of US imperialism in Asia became, in some ways, and particularly from like an American vantage point, more subtle. The end of the Vietnam War and the US kind of basically failure to prevent the formation of a unified socialist Vietnam, I think, you know, led to a different mode of engagement in Asia. And so like there hasn't been as explicit and violent of a US hot war in Asia since that time. And so we're left with a context in which US occupation remains, and the architecture of US occupation in places like Korea in places like Okinawa and the Philippines remains very much intact. And yet, you know, in some ways more subtle because, you know, during the Vietnam War, we saw the ways that Asian American anti-imperialists were pointing out like, oh, these bases are not just like a passive architecture, they are actively engaged in war. And we can see, you know, bomber jets leaving Okinawa, we can see warships leaving the Philippines headed for Vietnam. And that I think was a very like visceral way of understanding the ways in which these struggles were interconnected. I think that also the US has done a good job of like sowing divisions, not only between Asian American communities per se, but between Asian nations. And so there's been an erosion of third worldism, both as like a solidarity framework for Asian Americans, but perhaps more consequentially as a global kind of third world orientation. And so these struggles become more complicated. And, you know, along with US normalization of ties with China came really difficult periods in third world history, like the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1978, which I think really splintered the feelings of like unity that many people had in connecting these different Asian national liberation struggle. And so I think that's one layer of it. And I think another layer of it is that the US has become more sophisticated in the ways that it kind of massages the relationship between racism and imperialism. I think, you know, the prosecution of the Korean War, the prosecution of the Vietnam War were explicitly racist programs. And, you know, the rhetoric of US officials, the rhetoric of US media was very explicit in the dehumanization of Asian peoples. You know, the famous US generals who said life is cheap in the Orient, that kind of explicitly chauvinistic racist mentality was, I think, a weakness for US imperialism because it revealed the nature of US power abroad and US power in Asia in ways that Asian Americans could feel very acutely. And I think that since that time, and especially today, you know, we've seen a really concerted state effort to pledge commitments to, you know, standing against anti-Asian violence, standing against anti-Asian hate, mobilizing Asian Americans as like, you know, idealized model minority American citizens in a way that disconnects the phenomenon of racism from the structure of imperialism. And so, you know, a moment that I think is really symbolic of this strategy is that in 2021, after the Atlanta shootings, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was actually in Seoul doing like this big diplomatic tour of Asia to secure US interests, particularly vis-a-vis China amidst this escalating new Cold War. And so he actually, during a press conference in Seoul, referenced the shootings in Atlanta and like made this very lofty statement about how that kind of violence has no place in America and how he was committed to, you know, standing with the Korean American community and the Asian American community, while noting no sense of irony that he was essentially, you know, on this imperialist mission to consolidate US military hegemony in Korea. And so the ability for someone like Blinken to separate these two phenomena of anti-Asian violence at home and anti-Asian violence in the form of US empire, I think really speaks to this kind of strategy that has really weakened the ability of Asian Americans to mobilize in a way that connects struggles against racism to struggles against imperialism.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Mark, for all of your time and effort and sharing. And thank you for everyone in this meeting for all of your really rich questions. And I see Creighton your comment about anti-xenophobic or xenophobic and conflating that with anti-imperialism. It's a really important thread to draw out. And I think that leads me to I'll just end with some more announcements if that's okay. I don't know, Mark, if you wanted to share your email in the chat for anyone who had more questions.
Sure. Yeah, I will send my email in the chat, and I'm really happy to hear from anyone. It's always like a pleasure to talk to organizers. So I'd be excited to hear from anyone. I also can I plug one thing? I saw a comment that was mentioning a documentary called The Chinatown Files by Amy Chen. I just wanted to highlight that because it's a really fantastic resource that documents more of kind of the history of anti-communism and xenophobia during the Cold War.